Hey there, survivor. If you can hear this, it means you're still alive. This is Jack's Nightmares, and this is your next story. The first time I heard about the virus, it wasn't on the news. It was a patchy emergency alert buried under static on my shortwave. No visuals, just a choppy male voice reading off a bulletin. Something about an outbreak of viral hemorrhagic fever, suspected airborne, suspected zoonotic, the kind of alert you usually hear once, then never again. I didn't know what to make of it. Not right away. I was standing in the middle of my kitchen, pouring boiled creek water through the ceramic filter, and the only thing that stuck with me was how clinical the voice sounded. No panic, just data. At first, I figured it was either an old recording or some overseas incident being misreported. I didn't change anything that night, but the next morning, I noticed something I couldn't ignore. No aircraft, no contrails, no jet hum overhead, not even a distant one. That's rare out here. Even this deep in the mountains, I usually catch 1 or 2 flights a day carving lines above the pines. For 2 days, nothing. Then I heard the chopper. It came low from the northeast, wobbling bad. I stepped out onto the porch with my binoculars, caught a glimpse of it trailing smoke near the ridge. Not military, civilian paint. No tail number I could make out. It dipped behind the far trees and didn't come back up. I didn't hear an explosion, but about 15 minutes later I saw the column of smoke start to rise. By then, I'd been living out here almost full-time for 3 years. Bought the cabin after my divorce. Ex-electrician, no kids, early retirement after a back injury, and a union settlement I still feel guilty about. I didn't move up here because I thought the world was ending. I moved up here because I wanted quiet and no neighbors. But in hindsight, I guess that amounts to the same thing. The day after the crash, I climbed the ridge with my scope. I wanted a better look at the smoke trail before it faded. That's when I saw the first ones. 5 shapes walking through the trees. At first I thought they were survivors heading west, but their movements were wrong. One of them staggered like he had a spinal injury, dragging a leg sideways with no effort to correct. Another hunched low, like he was tracking scent instead of walking a trail. None of them were talking or looking at each other. They weren't a group. They were just heading in the same direction. That night, I started reinforcing the doors. Not full lockdown yet, but I moved the heavy bar into place and double-checked the ammo cans. I hadn't fired the rifle in weeks, but I cleaned it again anyway. Then I took the trail camera footage from the edge of the clearing and reviewed it just in case. I didn't like what I saw. A deer running hard through the brush. Unusual for the time of day. Unusual for this late in the year. It had blood down its rear haunches. 2 mornings later, something bumped the outhouse door. I didn't see it. I just heard the hinges creak, then steady footsteps crunching leaves just beyond the tree line. They circled the yard for hours. Never called out. Never knocked. No weapons. At least none I could see. The door stayed shut and I stayed silent until the sound faded. When I checked the snow line around the cabin that evening, I found a partial print with 4 deep heel marks and a barefoot impression that didn't match the season. That's when I stopped sleeping upstairs. I moved into the crawl space under the floorboards, sealed it with a blackout curtain, dragged down my mattress pad and sleeping bag, and started storing perishables in the root cellar. I spent that whole day making the cabin look abandoned. Burnt wood in the stove, curtains askew, a few chairs tipped over like someone had left in a hurry. I pulled the generator out of the lean-to and buried it behind the tool shed, ran a 30-foot line in a buried trench, and only ran it long enough to charge the inverter. I figured if anything came back, it would be looking for sound, smell, or movement, so I gave it none of those. I used the outhouse only after sunset and kept every light source covered. No open flames, just red-filtered flashlights and 1 small LED strip inside the cellar. By the 3rd night, I was down to 1 hot meal a day and boiling creek water twice daily just to keep ahead of what I had stored. The first time I saw one up close, he came straight into the clearing around 2 in the afternoon. Pale skin, torn forearms, cracked jaw. He didn't say anything, didn't look confused, didn't beg for help. He just walked straight toward the door like he already knew I was there. He didn't stop until I raised the rifle and shouted. Even then, no change in pace. The first round went wide. The second hit him high in the chest, but he barely reacted. The third shot hit him just above the right eye, and he dropped immediately. It wasn't adrenaline. It wasn't confusion. That man had no survival instinct left. I dragged the body 200 yards and buried it in a shallow trench, then poured 2 jugs of gasoline on it and lit the fire. I stayed upwind, but the stench still clung to my beard. I shaved it off that night, burned the clothes I wore while digging, and poured bleach around the fire pit the next morning, just to be safe. From that day on, I stopped assuming anything wandering through the trees was human. I watched from the loft, scope trained, counting steps, checking gait and posture. I kept track of the crows, how many came back, how long they circled a corpse before leaving. That's how I realized the burners don't last. They drop fast. Some seize up in the cold. Some bleed out through broken skin. Some just collapse mid-stride and never move again. But they burn hot and fast first. The real threat, I learned, was the quiet ones, the ones that waited. I first noticed them just before dusk, almost 2 weeks after I burned the first body. I was in the loft again, drinking weak tea made from pine needles and rainwater, watching the slope through the scope. I'd carved a few small lanes through the brush earlier that week just to keep visibility, and I caught movement near the western trail. Slow, deliberate. A shape ducked behind a fallen pine, waited there for close to 20 minutes, then crawled under the branches without snapping a single one. No sound, no urgency, just patience. That was not how the sick ones moved. The sick ones charged. They crashed through trees, slammed into doors, broke themselves on fences. They didn't care about cover. This one did. That's when I knew the virus, whatever it is, doesn't just burn people out. It changes them in stages. Maybe some of them last longer. Maybe some of them never burn out at all. I started calling them watchers in my head. Seemed accurate enough. They didn't always come close. Sometimes I'd only notice them when the squirrels went quiet or when a crow stopped mid-call. But they were there, sitting, watching. One of them even climbed halfway up a pine and stayed on the branch for over an hour without moving. I only saw him because the sun hit his shoulder through the needles. The problem with watchers wasn't just that they were smarter or quieter. It was that they didn't show signs of sickness the way the first wave did. No burst vessels on the skin, no convulsions, no blood streaks down the chest. Their skin looked dry like bark, and their eyes were glassy, but otherwise they could pass for a starving hiker at a glance. That scared me more than anything else. One night I heard footsteps on the porch. Not stomping, not frantic, just 1 foot, then a pause, then the next. I sat in the crawl space, rifle across my lap, barely breathing. My knees were locking up from the angle, but I didn't dare shift. The steps stopped near the door. I heard a breath. Deep, dry, not like wheezing, but more like a hollow exhale through the nose. Then silence. 20 minutes later, the sound of boots moving across gravel. When I checked the trail camera near the porch the next morning, the footage cut out just before midnight and didn't resume until after 3. Battery was fine. Card had space. That's when I stopped trusting the trail cams entirely. I started building blind spots of my own, places I could vanish into if something came too close. A fake brush pile out back, dug down 3 feet with a hatch under pine logs. A hollow stump I carved deep enough to sit inside, covered with moss netting. I knew how to blend in. Hunting does that to you. I never expected to use it to hide from people, or whatever these things are now. My hands were already giving me trouble by then. The nerve damage from the old injury never healed right, and gripping tools for too long made my fingers go numb. I had to break most tasks into 5-minute bursts. 10 minutes to split kindling meant 20 minutes of trying to work blood back into the fingertips. That slowed everything, setting traps, dragging firewood, reloading mags. Every step cost more now. I stopped going out to collect water daily, started using the gutter barrel again, even if the stuff tasted like leaf mulch. Food was holding, barely, but anything fresh was gone. I'd hunted light before all this, just small game, and only when I needed to. Now the rabbits had vanished, the squirrels too. The few prints I found near the creek looked twisted. One set had an extra toe. I followed those tracks for 2 hours once and found the animal dead under a rotted stump, eyes missing and chest burst open. Whatever this virus is, it doesn't stop with people. I called them sick creatures, not animals anymore. Some of them moved in jerks. Others crawled with their heads too low, like their necks weren't working right. A deer wandered into my trail one morning with a crooked spine and open sores around the mouth. I watched it chew bark off a dead tree for half an hour before it finally fell over, legs kicking. I didn't approach. Just let it die. I don't eat meat anymore. There was a man, real man, who showed up 3 days later. He stood at the edge of the clearing at noon, hands up, pack slung low across his back. He was covered in mud, no weapon visible. I kept him in my scope for 20 minutes. He didn't move, just kept saying he was looking for shelter. His voice cracked like he hadn't spoken in days. I almost stepped outside. I almost waved him in. Then I saw it. One of the watchers was behind him, 10 paces back, partially hidden under brush, crawling low. It froze whenever the man turned, stayed just out of sight. He didn't know. He had no clue what was following him. I didn't shoot. I couldn't risk the sound. Eventually the man walked off, took the southern path. I never saw him again. The days got colder. I started rationing matches. My left foot was acting up from the cold soak in the crawl space, so I wrapped it in a blanket and lined my boots with dried grass. My generator's pull cord snapped that week too. Took me half a day just to tear down the housing and replace it using an old shoelace. I don't have spares for most of this stuff. Everything I fix now feels like a one-time thing. And then it snowed. Not a full storm, just a dusting, enough to show tracks. That's when I knew for sure they weren't leaving. I counted 3 distinct sets of footprints circling the cabin in the early hours. One barefoot, one with boots, and one that looked like a child's butt with long heel drags. They didn't cross each other. They moved in separate loops, and every one of them stopped in the same spot near the porch, just outside the line of sight from my peephole. The next day, I packed a go bag and buried it out near the western ridge. Emergency food, water pouches, matches, sidearm, 1 extra mag, and iodine tablets, just in case I needed to leave in under a minute. I didn't think I'd use it, but the sense of something closing in hadn't faded. That night I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard in over a month. Human laughter. Not from the radio, not from memory. Outside, sharp and dry. It came from beyond the trail, where the snow thinned near the pines. 2 bursts spaced out. The first one high-pitched, like a child. The second one low and hollow. Then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The watchers didn't want to break in. They were testing something. Pacing, mapping, maybe waiting for the right condition. And I was slowly running out of ways to stay ahead of them. I stopped using the stove altogether and started burning twigs inside a sealed bucket with a chimney pipe. Less heat, less light, but no smoke. My cough got worse from it. Might be the ash, might be something else, but I didn't have much choice. I tried listening to the radio again. Nothing new, just static or garbled numbers. One loop repeated the same phrase every 6 hours. Shelter advised, avoid waterways, human-to-animal transmission confirmed. Waterways, that was new. I'd been using the creek for weeks. No filter can handle this if it's spreading that way. I dumped my remaining jugs and started boiling twice as long. Even then, I could taste something off. There's something about the way they wait that gets inside your thoughts. You start wondering if they know more than you, if they remember more than we think, if whatever's changing them isn't just destroying, but replacing, some kind of instinct that makes patience its own weapon. I started to catch myself drifting in the crawl space at night, not asleep, just stuck between thoughts, replaying the sound of footsteps that weren't there, holding my breath too long. The days were manageable, but the nights started to eat through me. Then it came. It was early morning. Not quite dawn, but the sky had turned grey behind the pines. I was boiling water on the small chimney bucket inside the cabin, which I hadn't done in days, just trying to get some warmth into my bones. I wasn't expecting anything. I wasn't even armed. That's the only reason it got that far. The front door buckled inward with a sharp crack. Not a slow pry or a push, just a sudden blast of force that drove the latch through the wood and sent the steel bolt spinning across the floor. I heard wood split, hinges tear loose, and then it was inside. A person, or close enough to pass as one. Thin, covered in torn layers of clothing, arms streaked with deep black sores. It didn't scream, didn't charge, just stepped in and locked eyes with me. I reacted late, grabbed the rifle from the bench behind me and raised it one-handed while stumbling backward toward the crawlspace hatch. My footing slipped. The thing moved fast, faster than any of the sick ones I'd seen so far. I got one shot off and clipped it through the upper thigh, which slowed it down enough for me to get behind the wood stove. It swiped at me and caught my shoulder through my flannel jacket. Deep gouges. I don't remember yelling. I remember the heat of blood running down my ribs and the feel of my fingers fumbling the bolt. Second shot dropped it, straight through the throat. It gargled and fell forward, catching the edge of the stove with its jaw. I kicked it back hard and stayed behind the bench with the barrel trained on it for at least 2 minutes before I dared move. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I hadn't felt fear like that since my accident. The kind of fear that freezes your limbs and slows everything down in your head. I patched the shoulder with what I had, a strip of cotton undershirt and alcohol wipes from the last med kit. Bled through 2 shirts and had to sleep sitting upright that night to keep pressure on the gash. That morning, I almost left. I had 1 duffel packed already. I stared at the trees beyond the outhouse, imagining what it'd take to disappear into them. The thought of being out there, no walls, no locks, no fallback, made my stomach twist. But the idea of staying, after that thing came straight through the front door without warning, made my hands itch for the truck keys. I didn't go that day. Instead, I waited 3 more, long enough to clean the wound, rebuild the door with heavier planks, and rig a bear trap outside the porch just in case something tried again. Then I made up my mind. I needed to know what was left in the valley. I needed to see the town. I keep the truck half a mile down the slope, tucked into a brush garage I built with pine logs and old tarp panels. It's a rust-colored, beat-up 4-cylinder pickup with bad alignment and a slow battery drain if I don't disconnect the leads. But I kept it maintained, fuel siphoned and rotated monthly. I hadn't driven it since the outbreak began, but it turned over after 2 tries. That sound, engine noise in the woods, almost made me kill the ignition right away. It felt too loud, but I let it run, and when the idle held steady, I knew I had 1 shot. The road to the town was narrow and washed out in spots. Snowmelt had flooded the lower dips, but I still knew every curve. I took the logging trail, crossed the old ranger's gate, and dropped onto the main highway by noon. The air felt thinner down there, lighter, like things had already passed through and moved on. The town used to be called Price Hollow, about 800 people, 1 grocery store, 2 gas stations, a small hardware shop, a pharmacy, and a volunteer fire station. I drove straight to Main Street and parked just past the diner. It was worse than I expected. Glass everywhere, doors caved in, not from looters, at least not only them. It looked like a riot had rolled through and stalled halfway. A sedan was up on the curb with dried blood smeared down the side. The door was open, no keys. Bodies here and there, but not many, mostly long dried. One still wearing a sheriff's jacket, face down by the school parking lot. I didn't see anyone moving, and that scared me more than if I had. A quiet town like that, after an outbreak, should still have noise. Scavengers, panicked survivors, even animals. But Price Hollow was just silent, not even the wind moving the flag at the post office. I didn't stay long. I went to the hardware store first. The front had already been broken open, but no one had touched the back wall. Shelves were mostly cleared, but I found a stash of tap adapters, sealant, clamps, wire spools, and heavy-duty plastic tubs still boxed under the service desk. I filled the cab with everything I could stack: tools, duct tape, hand saws, fire starters, hammers, and a bolt cutter. Next stop was the grocery. That's where I froze up. There was blood at the entrance, fresh streaks, newer than the others, maybe only a few days old. A trail that led down an aisle and disappeared behind a tipped freezer. I didn't follow it, just stayed low, stuck to the front, and grabbed what was in reach: dry beans, canned carrots, powdered milk, crackers, water bottles, cooking oil. Then I spotted the truck. Parked half a block away, tucked between the alley behind the bar and the feed store. It was a contractor's rig, bed full of solar panels still wrapped in foam. The side door was open, blood down the driver's seat. No one inside. I crept over, checked the cab, and saw the power station on the floor behind the seat. Big unit, portable battery, newer model than I ever had the cash to buy. Screen was still blinking green. I didn't even think. I hot-wired the ignition using the few tricks I'd remembered from my cousin back when we were younger and dumb. Engine was dead, battery drained, but the cab was clean aside from the blood and a torn coat. I checked the glove box, spare keys. I moved everything worth keeping into my truck, loaded the solar panels gently, lashed them tight, took the portable battery, the tools, the sealed food, blankets from the back of the bar, added a few gallons of lamp oil and boxes of mason jars from the feed store. I even grabbed new work gloves. Mine were frayed, soaked in old blood, and torn at the cuffs. I didn't look back when I drove out of Price Hollow. It was after dark by the time I made it back up the trail. I parked the truck under the brush cover and started hauling supplies by hand. It took 4 trips to get everything near the cabin. I didn't risk opening the main door. I stashed the gear behind the shed and spent the night in the crawl space again, waiting to see if anything had followed me. Nothing came, not that night. The next morning, I started digging. I chose the slope behind the cabin. The soil there was dry, packed with stone, hard to work, but also less likely to collapse during snowmelt. I used my father's old trench spade and the pickaxe I found in the truck bed. For the first time in weeks, I felt focused. No pacing, no peering through the trees. I had a task, and it mattered. By evening, I had cleared enough to start framing the edges with salvaged timber and old fence posts. I wasn't building a bomb shelter. I was building a place where I could sleep, eat, and survive if the cabin went. A true fallback, sealed from light, smell, and cold. The solar panels were mounted against the slope with wood supports. I ran the lines into the portable battery unit inside a vented container, stored under a camo tarp with rocks piled on top. I only turned it on to test. It worked. Enough wattage to run the water filter, recharge lights, and even heat a small coil for cooking if I kept it rationed. I didn't plan to hide forever, but I needed time. Time to heal the shoulder, time to test the new setup, time to finish the dig before the ground froze solid. The first snowfall that stuck around hit 2 nights after I returned from Price Hollow. It was light, not more than an inch, but it hardened the top layer of earth like stone. My shoulder was still sore and stiff, wrapped tight in a reused compression bandage, and every shovel strike felt like it echoed all the way down to my ribs. But I knew, if I didn't finish now, I might never get another chance. I started sketching out a plan on the inside flap of a cereal box. The back of it was blank. I marked out the slope, the location of the root cellar, the truck shed, and the fake brush pile blind. Then I added the digging zone behind the cabin, where the ground had the least visible frost lines. I measured dimensions by pacing it myself. 10 steps across, 15 down, then back again in a square. Depth would depend on the rock layer. If I hit shale or old roots, I'd have to adjust. The idea wasn't to create a military bunker. I wasn't aiming for a vault door or ventilation systems. I needed a place below ground that I could heat with body warmth and a small coil, seal off during night movement, and keep stocked with enough supplies to last through another winter. The kind of place I could live inside for a week if I had to wait something out. I took the sketch seriously, Every time a new thought came to mind, soundproofing, runoff drainage, back exit route, I wrote it down in the margins. The thing with trauma is, it clouds memory. Some days I'd forget basic things, where I'd stashed tools, whether I'd eaten, which rifle magazine had been cycled. Writing it down became more than prep, it was sanity. I kept getting interrupted. Not by people, not always. The forest wasn't empty anymore, and it never stayed quiet for long. Some nights I'd hear soft movements near the edge of the tree line, slow crunching of frost-crusted pine needles, rhythmic, measured. Other times it was a single thump, like a boot or a fist landing against bark. Once, then, silence. One morning I found a small pile of crushed mushrooms stacked on the center of my firewood pile. Damp, reeking of rot, fresh enough to still stain my gloves when I brushed them off. I hadn't touched mushrooms in weeks. That wasn't my doing. Someone, or something, left it there. I didn't mention that out loud. I just circled it on the sketch as unknown contact attempt, underlined it twice, then added a plan to store firewood inside from now on. By the second week of digging, my palms were blistered raw. I had gloves, but they'd been torn so many times I might as well have used my bare hands. I rotated between the shovel, pick and bucket, hauling dirt by hand and using old storage bins to carry the excess behind the tool shed. I didn't want to make a visible mound. That kind of thing attracts attention. Anything out of pattern stands out, even to things that don't think like us anymore. I framed the walls using cut timber from a half-fallen lodgepole pine near the ridge. Dragging it back took 2 full days, and halfway through the second trip I had to stop and hide under a downed log, while 2 sick creatures moved through the area. They didn't speak, just sniffed the air and limped. One of them had antlers, real ones, half-grown from his scalp, curling up through matted hair and skin. Whether they were bone grafts, mutations, or remnants from infection, I have no idea. I stayed still, didn't breathe. When they moved on, I finished hauling the wood and collapsed in the crawl space with a heat pack on my back for hours. The battery I found in town was working better than expected. I wired it to a small charge controller and used one of the intact panels to run a filtered light strip and the water purifier. The luxury of cold, clear water without boiling gave me more energy than I knew I had left. It was quiet energy, clean. No engine rumble. I used it only during the day, with blackout covers drawn over the cellar entrance. The new shelter took shape slowly. I laid out pallets on the dirt floor to keep gear dry, insulated the walls with old moving blankets layered behind the timber frame, and lined the roof with leftover plastic wrap, held down by heavy tarp. The entrance hatch was a disguised sheet of corrugated metal covered in frozen pine needles and branches. I added a pull rope that dropped it from the inside and locked it with a bar cut from rebar. Nothing fancy, but tight enough to stop an arm from reaching through. I marked another note on the cereal box plan. Dig secondary crawl tunnel toward the south tree line, just in case. Haven't started it yet. No strength left. At night, I kept hearing things further off. Not right outside, but distant. Hollow thuds. The sound of something dragging across frozen ground. Once I heard a metal-on-metal scrape like a chain being pulled through gravel. I didn't investigate. I kept the rifle next to the cot and slept with boots on. One night I slipped. Just outside the shelter entrance, carrying a tub of frozen rice and lentils, I caught a root and went down hard. Left knee slammed into stone. No break, but the pain was sharp enough I had to crawl back inside. I wrapped it in a thermal bandage and gritted through it, but the swelling slowed everything the next 2 days. During that downtime, I rechecked the sketch, made updates, added angles of approach from the ridge, wind direction tracking, potential blind spots. If I couldn't build faster, I'd plan smarter. I even added a wind chime tripwire made from old shell casings and fishing line, strung between the trees behind the cabin. Then, just as I thought I had a rhythm again, I saw him. Broad shoulders, wearing what looked like a firefighter's jacket, standing just beyond the clearing, half hidden by branches. Not a sound, just watching. Head tilted slightly. I raised my scope and aimed at his chest. He didn't flinch. I lowered it, blinked, looked again. He was gone. No movement, no sound of retreat, just vanished. That night I didn't sleep. Every few hours I climbed into the loft to scan the woods, but nothing showed. No prints, no signs of entry, just silence and frost. The next morning, I moved the food stash underground and buried the remaining bags of rice in sealed tubs under the pallets. I took apart one of the toolboxes and rigged a small clay pot heater from canned fuel and bricks, placed it in the far corner for warmth without smoke. I left a note on the wall of the shelter, scribbled in charcoal from the stove. If I don't come back, the slope is stable. Do not dig past the old fence post. No one may ever read it, but I felt better having it there. Every piece of me was starting to feel slower, knees stiff, hands losing grip, old injury in my lower back flaring up. There's no ER for people like me now. No one to call. I keep an old compression belt wrapped in plastic, and I'm down to my last tube of pain cream. I use it sparingly, only when I need full movement. Even with the new supplies, everything has a limit. Canned food runs out, solar gear breaks, traps wear down or go untouched. I haven't caught anything edible in over a week. Either everything fled, died, or got sick. Still, every day the shelter gets stronger. Every trip I make with a bucket of frozen dirt, every layer of tarp I add, every tool I restore, it brings me a little closer to something real. Not just surviving, living, holding ground. I'm not under the illusion this place is safe forever. It's not. But it's better than open road. Better than wondering which tree line they'll step out from next. Every day I stay alive here is one more day I understand the rhythm of the woods, of the creatures, of the limits of what I can still control. But that control's been shrinking, and lately, it feels like I'm one bad misstep from losing it completely. It started with a practical thought. Connect the bunker to the cabin, not above ground, where it could be spotted. Underground, a crawl tunnel, tight and dark, just wide enough for a man on elbows and knees to move between the two. That way, if the cabin was compromised, I could still escape to the shelter without exposing myself to open ground. Or if I was in the shelter and heard movement upstairs, I'd have a way to flank around, see what I was walking into. Digging that tunnel became the next priority. The main trench was already stable. I laid out the path with old clothesline string and started tunneling sideways toward the cabin foundation. Every couple of feet, I reinforced the walls with thin logs and plastic. It wasn't elegant, but it didn't need to be. It just had to hold long enough to move through once or twice in an emergency. But there was a problem. My tools were wearing out. Handles cracked. My only lantern bulb flickered every time the battery dropped below 30%. I'd rigged a system to store power from the solar panels into the battery, but the cables were frayed, and the voltage meter had failed. I was running blind, using gear that wouldn't survive another winter. That's when I decided to go back into town again. Not for anything huge, no major hauls, just small things that made the difference. Wiring, LED strips, motion-activated lights if any were left, and maybe a second battery if I could find one that wasn't dead. I wanted sensors this time too, something to alert me before someone was standing on the porch. I left at dawn. Truck had just enough fuel for one more full round trip, so topping off was part of the mission. I took the back trails again, same as before, and avoided the paved road entirely. Past 3 abandoned vehicles on the route. None had anything left worth taking. Doors open, windows smashed, blood dried into the carpet. I didn't stop to look. When I reached the edge of Price Hollow, the air had changed. There was smoke in it. Not fire smoke, something else. Greasier, like burned rubber or melted wiring. It clung to the low places, moved slow, and left an oily film on my windshield. I pulled a bandana over my mouth and parked behind the post office, out of sight. The main intersection was worse than before. Someone had dragged furniture into the middle of the road. Makeshift barricades maybe. Piles of tires and broken chairs stacked high. It looked recent, maybe within the last week, but no bodies. No new signs of life either. I moved fast. First stop was the hardware store again, still ransacked, but I hadn't checked the basement before. Found a back stairwell blocked by a fallen shelf, but I got through. Downstairs was cold and dry, and whoever cleaned the upper floor hadn't bothered with it. I found 3 reels of solid copper wire, half a box of LED bulb packs, a motion sensor floodlight still sealed, and 2 rolls of reflective tape. Jackpot. Next, I hit the small auto shop 2 blocks over. The garage door was partially open, and I nearly missed the body wedged under the lift. Looked like he died trying to get to a jerry can. There were drag marks nearby, but no sign of what took him down. I didn't touch the body, just grabbed 2 fuel containers from a metal rack and filled them from the shop's emergency tank. It was slow, gravity-fed, but clean. Then I found the camera system. In the back office of the feed supply store, place I hadn't bothered checking last time, I spotted a shelf of boxed electronics, probably meant for monitoring livestock. One was a solar-powered trail camera system with 4 cameras and a base station, battery-powered, motion-triggered, wireless. Range was short, but it'd work for my perimeter if I placed them close. I took the box, a full set of lithium batteries from the display case, and a second box with an older model thermal scanner meant for wildlife counting. I was almost done. Just one last detour to the grocery again to look for more soap, maybe some sealed coffee if I was lucky. That's when I heard footsteps in the back aisle. Not the sick. These were measured, boots on tile, deliberate. I ducked behind the end cap and waited. Couldn't see who it was. Couldn't hear breathing. Just the steady sound of someone walking, checking each row. One pass, then silence. I didn't wait for confirmation. I crawled through the broken freezer section and slipped out the back door. No one followed, but I heard a car start 5 minutes later, an old diesel engine, coughing as it turned over. Someone else had a working vehicle. Someone else was watching the same town I was. I drove back fast, took the ridge bypass and used engine braking to keep the noise down. The truck bed was full. Tools, wires, food, jerry cans, and electronics. Enough to last another few months if I was careful. Enough to make the place feel less like a trap and more like a home again. Back at the cabin, I spent 3 days wiring up the motion lights, mounted them on trees near the clearing with timers set to the lowest sensitivity. If anything larger than a rabbit crossed that line, the lights would flare. I also placed the trail cams facing outward in 4 directions: main trail, outhouse path, front porch, and the root cellar slope. I rigged the camera base to the portable battery and installed the screen inside the bunker, taped over every LED with blackout fabric so no light leaked, set a small mirror near the ceiling so I could see the display from the bed if it lit up. It was working, for now. I spent the next 4 days driving thin stakes into the frozen ground around the full perimeter of the cabin and bunker slope. I had no fencing mesh, so I used cord and scavenged warning tape. The point wasn't to keep anything out, it was to slow them down, change their approach patterns, give me some warning. I added cans on strings, shell traps, even a couple of sharpened garden stakes mounted low to trip anything that rushed too fast. It wasn't elegant, but nothing out here is. It was a net of crude, last-ditch defenses, something I could reset with 1 good arm and half an hour of daylight. With everything in place, I took my last full bottle of alcohol from the cabinet, poured a half shot, and sat in the hatchway with the dog-eared sketch beside me. I crossed off every major item, added new ones, reinforced tunnel braces, make second chimney outlet, refill medical box. Then I added a new section at the bottom. What happens if I can't stay here? Because that was the truth underneath it all. I could prepare, I could dig, I could plan, but eventually this place will be too obvious, too picked over, too surrounded. If the strange ones start organizing, or if the smoke spreads further, this cabin won't be enough, and deep down I knew it. Sooner or later, I'd have to either make this place final, or have a second way out, maybe both. I went back to the drawing, laid out a more permanent plan for the shelter. What started as a trench and timber-framed hideout needed to become a true bunker. The second exit was the first step, a narrow passage running parallel to the main tunnel, cutting out behind the east side of the cabin. I'd need to dig deeper, reinforce it with thicker supports, add a false rock cover at the exit point. It wouldn't survive heavy snowpack or fire, but it would let me slip out if anyone, or anything, blocked the front. I marked a second storage chamber in the plan too, perpendicular to the sleeping space. That's where I'd keep the more sensitive gear: battery, camera base, electronics, anything that couldn't get wet. I'd build a basic trench drainage system by digging a small gravel channel from the far side of the chamber out to the slope, lined with scrap plastic tubing I'd pulled from an old HVAC unit. Crude, but if the snow melt flooded me out, it'd buy me time. Comfort mattered too. Not luxury, just small things. I hadn't taken off my boots indoors in weeks. I kept telling myself it was safer that way, but really, I just hadn't carved out the space to let myself breathe. So I started building up the sleeping area with care. Laid down a second layer of pallet slats, added a roll of old carpeting I'd pulled from the cabin closet, and stuffed pine needles between the wall timbers for insulation. I wrapped the tarp ceiling tighter, cut a ventilation slit into the far corner, and placed a mirror fragment so I could check it without standing. I also wired in the motion lights from the trail cams to trigger a low decibel chime inside the bunker. The tone was soft, barely a whisper, but I could hear it clearly in the dark. That way I'd know when something crossed the perimeter without lighting up the woods like a beacon. I taped a flashlight above the hatch with a toggle switch. If I needed to move, I could do it fast. The food situation wasn't bad, but I was burning more calories now. The digging, the hauling, the wood splitting. It adds up. I started rationing the newer canned goods and dipping into older stuff. Mostly rice and beans, salted crackers, dry oatmeal. I still hadn't caught any game worth eating, so I figured it was time to try the water again. I packed light. No fire, no cookware, just a bucket, my handline, a thermos, and the old 22 for backup. I made the hike to the river trail near the old campsite. Snow covered most of the prints, but the deeper ones from deer and elk were visible, until they weren't. Halfway to the bank, all sign of animal traffic stopped. Not diverted, just ended. I pushed through the underbrush and reached the shoreline by mid-morning. Ice had started to form along the banks, but the current was still moving in the center. I unspooled the line, baited it with an old piece of dried jerky, and cast 3 times across different spots. Waited each time. Nothing. Not a single twitch. I gave it 2 hours. Watched the water, listened to the trees, counted the gaps in the wind. It felt wrong. Not empty. Wrong. Like the fish weren't there anymore, or didn't want to be. I packed up and started walking the edge of the river, heading upstream toward a bend I used to visit back in early fall. That's where I found him. A body, caught between 2 tree roots, mostly buried in the snow. Torn hiking pack a few feet away. The man was face down, arms tucked under, as if he'd tried to crawl. His clothes were faded, edges stiff with ice. Part of one leg had been chewed away, hard to say by what. Teeth marks weren't human. Then again, neither were the patterns I'd seen before. I didn't touch him, just stood there for a while, looked at the frost gathering around his hood. Maybe he'd been a hiker, maybe a tourist who thought the roads were still open when he came through. Either way, he'd been dead a long time, a month, maybe more. I did check the pack. Most of it was ruined, empty wrappers, busted water filter, crushed binoculars. But in the side pocket was a small flashlight and a scratched-up old PSP handheld console. Looked like it had been buried in there for a while. I took the flashlight and the console. Felt weird, like stealing from the dead, but I told myself if I didn't take it, something else would. Back at the cabin, I plugged the PSP into my battery using an adapter I'd salvaged months ago. It didn't light up at first. Then, after a minute, the screen blinked once. The boot logo loaded. I don't know why, but I smiled. It had a few games still loaded on it. Nothing fancy. An old shooter, a racing sim, one pixel art platformer I vaguely remembered from years back. I played for 20 minutes that night, curled in the bunker with a blanket over my lap, hand on my pistol, lights off except the glow of that tiny screen. It felt stupid, and warm, and strange. I kept the console next to the inverter. Might never use it again, might need to someday. Not for fun, but for clarity, just to remember what time used to feel like. 3 days later, the first real snow hit. Not dust, not sleet. Thick, wet snowfall that came fast and didn't stop. It dropped almost 10 inches in a day, and kept falling. By the third morning, the whole cabin was half buried. The truck was just a shape under the white. The trail cams were frozen over, useless until I thawed and cleaned them. That's when I learned the value of prep. I'd reinforced the shelter slope, made sure the drain trench had gravel fill and a runoff path. Even so, I spent 2 days shoveling by hand, carving a channel around both the cabin and the bunker entrance. If I didn't, the melt would flood both out in a week. Snow meant more silence, footsteps muffled, no visual tracking. The stakes I'd planted around the perimeter were buried. That meant anything could come close without me knowing. So I cleared a narrow path around the full loop. Took me hours. Had to work by quadrant, pacing each section, shoveling by lamplight. I started sleeping in the house less. It was warmer, sure. The chimney vent still worked, and the bed was better for my back. But I couldn't shake the memory of the one that broke through the door. I kept seeing its shoulders, its eyes, the way it didn't make a sound as it charged. Now I sleep mostly in the shelter. Still use the house to cook, to warm up briefly, to do repairs where I need light. But when it gets dark, I move below. Rifle loaded, light off, screen dimmed. One blanket over the entrance seam, another over my knees. I check the camera feeds 3 times before sleeping. Always in the same order. Trail cam 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 by the trail, 2 by the root cellar, 3 at the blind, 4 covering the slope. For weeks, nothing but falling snow and twitching branches. Then one night, cam 3 glitched. Just a blip. The signal cut for 2 seconds, came back with a static burst, then froze. I assumed it was the cold, or build-up on the lens. But when I reviewed the playback from the day before, I caught a frame I couldn't explain. A smear of dark grey, like cloth or skin, just close enough to block the lens completely. No animal would move like that. I stayed up the rest of the night listening. Thought I heard scraping, but nothing crossed into light range. At first light I went out, full winter gear, rifle slung, and crept to Cam 3's location. The tripod was knocked over, bent. The camera was cracked across the faceplate. In the snow nearby, 4 clear indentations. Fingers, spread wide, deeper than they should have been. That same day, I moved the extra light to the rear tree line and wired a backup motion sensor facing the opposite direction. I placed an old wind chime above the slope and tied a tripwire to a tin can buried under snow near the path. Passive, quiet, enough to give me warning. For 2 days, nothing. On the 3rd, I lost cam 1. No glitch this time, just static. When I went out to check, the camera was gone. Not broken, gone. Mount was still there, baseplate cracked in half, but the actual unit was missing, and I found something else. A patch of soot-stained snow. Something had burned there. Maybe cloth, maybe skin. The smell was still in the air, charred and sour. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I pulled my backup gas heater into the bunker and ran it long enough to dry everything out. The snow melt had slowed, but the air inside was damp, and I couldn't afford mold. I tightened the entrance seal, closed the crawl tunnel hatch, and stayed below for 2 full days. The PSP still worked. I played the platformer for 20 minutes just to stop pacing. Then the burn smell came back. It wasn't from inside. It came from above, from the floorboards, thick and sharp like burning hair mixed with plastic. I killed the lights and sat with my ear to the ceiling, listening. That's when I heard it. Breathing, shallow, right above me. Then a soft patter. something dragging a palm along the cabin floor. I waited hours. No movement, no sound. Eventually, I took the tunnel to the crawl space beneath the house. Climbed up slow, listening the whole time. I raised the hatch just enough to peek through the cracks. The back door was open, just a sliver. Snow blew in through the seam. I kept my rifle pointed at the gap and stepped out. The smell was stronger now, burnt rubber and decay. Near the kitchen table, I found a trail of black soot on the floor, ash mixed with something else, almost oily. That's when the knock came. Not at the front, not the door, the wall. 3 heavy knocks, measured, then silence. I turned off everything, battery, light, even the wall fan, dropped into the crawl space and waited. 5 minutes. 10. No follow-up. I didn't go out. Not that day. That night, the wind chime rang. Once. I bolted upright, threw the monitor on. Cam 2 flashed on. Snow. Cam 3, static. Cam 4, movement. A shape, low to the ground, moving with speed. Then it stopped. Crouched. Just inside the frame. I saw its arm move upward. Long, emaciated, dark and cracked. It held something. A long stick. No, an antler. It dragged the tip across the snow. Slowly, deliberate lines. I didn't know what it was doing until I checked the cam the next morning. It had drawn a spiral, 10 feet wide, right outside the blind I used to watch the slope. That's when I decided to fight, not by charging out, not by hunting it down, but by making this place less vulnerable, more prepared, less soft. I started by sealing the cabin. Every window was now bolted shut. I took the old steel mesh from the shed and hammered it across the inside frames, removed the front door completely, and replaced it with 2 overlapping timber slabs, braced together with lag bolts and iron strap. The back door got the same treatment. Next came the fire line. I cleared the brush around the shelter down to the dirt. 10-foot perimeter. No foliage, just hard snow, gravel, and frost-bitten soil. Anything that came close would be visible. I mounted the rest of the motion lights and wired them through an internal switch panel. I could control each one individually now. The tunnel between the cabin and the shelter got reinforced too. I cut more timber beams, added cross-bracing, and mounted a tripwire alarm halfway through. If anyone followed me down, I'd know. 3 days later, it returned. Not a person, not the same thing from before. This one was bigger. Cam 4 picked it up first. Massive shape, hunched, moving across the rear tree line. It didn't run, it stalked. The trail cam caught flashes of it. Thick shoulders, body wrapped in layers of tattered fabric, steam rising off its back like it was running hot. Its hands dragged across the trees, leaving black scorch marks in the bark. I powered off the bunker light and waited, rifle loaded. The air was so still, I could hear the snow shifting above. Then the sensor light flared outside. Full burst, white light on snow. I flipped on the screen. There it was, standing in the clearing. It didn't move for 20 seconds. Then it turned toward Cam 4 and walked straight at it. The feed cut out. I pulled the battery switch and waited in silence, hand on the rifle grip, every muscle tensed. Hours passed. The light never came back on. At dawn, I climbed up and crept through the cabin. Everything was intact, no forced entry, but the clearing. Scorch marks in the snow, a path burned through the powder. Not footprints, wide tracks, as if something massive had been dragged across it. The spiral it drew days before was gone, melted through the frost into the earth. And in the middle, ashes. I didn't leave the shelter again for days. I rationed strictly, didn't light anything, just checked the perimeter from time to time and logged each sensor alert. Then, just when I started thinking it had passed, the backup solar feed failed. The battery was fine, connections checked out, but the panels cracked, as if something had struck them with full force. Every cell shattered. That night, I made a new plan. I still had fuel. I still had the truck. But now, for the first time, I was thinking seriously about leaving. Not as a backup, as the next step. I sat in the shelter with the box of gear I'd packed weeks earlier, pulling items out one at a time. Dried food packets, iodine tabs, a fire striker, the portable charger, extra socks. The rifle sat across my lap, cleaned and ready. It wasn't a fantasy. I was ready to go if I had to, but part of me didn't want to. Not yet. Not unless I absolutely had no other choice. The wind had shifted that evening. The air outside the shelter was damp, warmer than it should have been, as if something had stirred up the snowpack from underneath. I watched the camera feeds carefully, each one now slightly fogged from the cold and low battery draw, but functioning. The spiral the creature had burned into the snow hadn't returned. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closer now. The warning came just before midnight, a soft chime, 2 notes, from the motion sensor tied to the blind. I sat up and froze. No false alarms in days. I flipped the screen switch. Feed came through grainy. Cam 3 showed only static. Cam 4 showed wind across the clearing. Then Cam 2 blinked. Movement. A shape darted past the frame, too fast to identify. Then it doubled back, slower. I caught it this time. Broad shoulders, arms too long for its frame, blackened skin stretching across its ribs. It had no eyes, at least none I could see. It turned, tilting its head toward the camera, like it could sense the lens watching it. Then it moved forward, not toward the camera, toward the shelter slope. I shut the monitor and killed the inverter, rolled silently from the cot and took my position under the hatch ladder, rifle propped against the wall. The footsteps above were deliberate, not heavy stomps. These were paced, paused, sniffed. Then the unmistakable sound of the tin tripwire being brushed. Not tripped, brushed. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't stupid. Then I heard it breathing, above the hatch. I didn't move, didn't blink. My grip stayed loose. If the hatch opened, I'd only get one clean shot before it dropped in. But it didn't open. It moved to the side. I could hear it sliding its weight across the slope, feeling the edges. And then the sound I feared most. Metal bending. It found the corner seam of the main hatch plate and started prying. The rebar lock bowed once with a high-pitched squeal. I waited for the plate to lift. Waited until I could see the dark crease of its fingers curl under the lip. Then I yanked the tripwire I'd strung inside, pulled it hard. The bear trap above snapped. The shriek wasn't human. The hatch flew open halfway before slamming shut again under the creature's weight. I scrambled up the ladder, kicked the emergency bar aside, and threw the hatch fully open. The thing was still on the slope, one leg caught high in the trap. It turned its head fast, faster than anything should, and locked onto me. I didn't hesitate. First shot hit center mass. Knocked it backward a few inches, but it didn't fall. Second shot hit just above the collar. It screamed, mouth wide, lips peeled back, but didn't stop moving. It pulled against the trap with everything it had. I stepped forward, raised the rifle. Third shot, dead between the eyes. It dropped. For a long time, I didn't move, just stood there in the snow, gun still aimed, breath steaming out in long white bursts. The wind picked up, trees creaked, no more movement, no backup, no followers. I hauled the thing's body out of the trap and burned it immediately, dragged it into the fire pit I'd used for the first one all those months ago, used a full gallon of fuel. The smoke stung my eyes. By morning, there was only ash and bone. Then, for the first time in weeks, silence returned. 3 days later, I found the deer. It had been caught in a leg snare not far from the river path. A clean, heavy buck, still breathing when I found it, but just barely. No signs of sickness, no burst vessels, no lesions, no behavioral tics. I knelt beside it, ran my hand gently across its chest, and whispered thanks before I ended it clean. I butchered it with care, packed the quarters into clean tubs and stored them in the snow pit. Boiled the fat down into tallow. Even cured a few strips over the stovepipe in the house. I hadn't tasted real meat in months. It felt like waking up. The snow began to melt a week later. Not fast, not all at once, but steady. The runoff followed the trenches I'd dug, just as planned. The shelter stayed dry. The cabin floor stayed solid. The earth softened underfoot. I spent every clear day reinforcing what I had. Dug the secondary exit fully. Rebuilt the panel box for the battery. Sealed every crack in the crawl tunnel. The cabin got a full sweep too. Walls repainted with leftover sealant, floors washed with boiled pine and soap. I made it livable again. Then, with the weather holding and no movement on the cams for almost 2 weeks, I made another trip to town. It felt different this time. No dread, just purpose. I knew what I needed. Rope, nails, work gloves, baking soda, fresh buckets, coffee if any remained sealed. Comfort, not just survival. The town hadn't changed much. Still broken glass and silence. Still the remnants of what used to be. But this time, I moved through it like it was mine. Not because I wanted it, but because I'd lasted long enough to claim it. I brought back everything I could carry. Even a set of worn books from the library, manuals, old repair guides, anything that could still teach me something. I restocked the house, added a shelf to the bunker, started keeping a daily log. I still don't know how far the sickness spread, still don't know if others like me made it through, but I do know this. Something changed the day I fought back. Not the world, me. I stopped waiting to be overrun, started acting like I could outlast it, maybe even fix something. The snow's almost gone now. The sun hits the clearing longer each day. The birds haven't returned, but the trees creak louder in the wind. Maybe that's enough. I'm not going anywhere, not yet. This is still my ground. And whatever comes next, I'll be ready. And that's where we'll stop for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me how the story hit you, what moments worked, what didn't, and what you'd want to hear next. And a big thank you to everyone supporting the channel, especially with extra membership: Carlos Herrera, Dominique Johnson, The Great Anywho, Jade Allah, Madam Midnight, Deborah Powell, William Blackwell, TJR, Baby Doll. You keep this project alive. Until next time, Survivor. Jack's Nightmares signing off.